I will address Israel's legal obligations under international humanitarian law concerning the provision of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian civilian population, and then Israel's legal obligations under the rules of international law set out in the Court's advisory opinion of 19 July 2024. I will conclude with some observations on Israel's legal obligations under overlapping rules of international humanitarian law and international criminal law. I begin with an update on the situation on the ground. On 1 March 2025, Israel announced that it would unilaterally end the 6-week ceasefire that had prevailed since mid-January, and that it would resume aerial bombardment and other armed attacks against Gaza. On the following day, 2 March, the office of the Prime Minister made this announcement. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has decided that as of this morning, the entry of all goods and supplies to the Gaza Strip will be halted. The Prime Minister's decision immediately cut off all humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza. This was underscored by the head of Israel's civil administration for the occupied territory and Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, in another post on the same day. The decision we made last night to completely halt humanitarian aid to Gaza until Hamas is destroyed or completely surrenders and all our hostages are returned is an important step in the right direction, the threshold of the gates of hell. Now we need to open those gates as quickly and lethally as possible on the cruel enemy until absolute victory. Israel's Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, made clear that the cruel enemy was not just Hamas, but the entire civilian population of Gaza. He addressed this message specifically to them. Citizens of Gaza, this is your last warning. The Air Force attack against Hamas terrorists was only the first step. The rest will be significantly worse, and you will pay the price. Unless all the Israeli hostages are released and Hamas is expelled from Gaza, Israel will act with forces never before seen. The alternative is utter destruction and devastation. In keeping with these official Israeli statements, all humanitarian assistance intended for the civilian population of Gaza has been blocked by Israel since 2 March. No food, no water, no medicine, no fuel, no anything. For 57 days and still counting, Israel has prevented all goods and services of any kind from entering Gaza. On 9 March, Israel's energy minister, Eli Cohen, posted a picture of himself on the social media platform X, signing an order to cut off electricity to Gaza. The message accompanying the photo read, "I have now signed an order to cut off electricity to the Gaza Strip immediately. Enough with the talk. It's time for action." The impact of this action was to shut down the lone desalination plant in Gaza, depriving more than 600,000 Palestinians of their only access to water. Overall, the consequences for the Palestinian civilian population, especially the deprivation of urgently needed humanitarian assistance, have been as promised by Defense Minister Katz: utter destruction and devastation. According to the United Nations Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, who briefed the Security Council on 18 March, today I am distressed to report that in addition to the intense airstrikes that have resumed, since 2 March, Israeli authorities have cut off the entry of all life-saving supplies, food, medicines, fuel, cooking gas, for 2.1 million people. This total blockade of life-saving aid and basic commodities and commercial goods will have a disastrous impact on the people of Gaza, who remain dependent on a steady flow of assistance into the Strip. Blocking food, water, and medicine for people who need them is unconscionable. It also goes against international humanitarian law and the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice. Mr. President, members of the court, the Undersecretary General is plainly right. The facts on which his statement is based are not in dispute. As you have seen, they're admitted, proudly and loudly proclaimed by Israel's most senior government officials. Nor can there be any dispute about the applicable law. In its July 2024 advisory opinion, the court explained that international humanitarian law governs Israel's conduct in the OPT for as long as its occupation continues. Israel must thus comply with its obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention, of which it is a state party, and Additional Protocol 1, the relevant articles of which are part of customary international law. The indisputable evidence shows that Israel has flagrantly violated these obligations. They include, first, the obligation under Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention to ensure, to the fullest extent of the means available, provision of, quote, the food and medical supplies of the population. Under this article, Israel has an affirmative duty to, quote, bring in the necessary foodstuffs, medical stores, and other articles if the resources of the occupied territory are inadequate, which is undeniably the case throughout the Gaza Strip. Article 69 of Additional Protocol 1 further requires Israel to ensure the provision of, quote, clothing, bedding, means of shelter, and other supplies essential to the survival of the civilian population of the occupied territory. Second, Israel has the obligation under Article 56 of the Convention to ensure and maintain, to the fullest extent of the means available to it, quote, the medical and hospital establishments and services, public health and hygiene in the occupied territory. Article 56 further provides, quote, medical personnel of all categories shall be allowed to carry out their duties. Israel has been blatantly violating these obligations, and not only since 2 March, it has been violating them for many years, most egregiously since October 2023. On 9 October 2023, Israel announced a complete siege of the Gaza Strip, cutting off essential resources and the movement of goods, including food, water, medicines, fuel, and electricity. All crossing points between Israel and the Gaza Strip were sealed. Israel's defense minister at the time, Yoav Gallant, described his government's strategy in these terms, quote,
we are imposing a complete siege on Gaza. There will be no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything will be closed. We are fighting against human animals, and we are acting accordingly.
The United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry found that this was precisely what Israel did. Quote, throughout the siege on Gaza, Israel has weaponized the withholding of life-sustaining necessities, specifically by cutting off supplies of water, food, electricity, fuel, and other essential supplies, including humanitarian assistance. On 6 December 2023, the Secretary General reported to the Security Council, we are facing a severe risk of collapse of the humanitarian system. The situation is fast deteriorating into a catastrophe with potentially irreversible implications for Palestinians as a whole and for peace and security in the region. In response, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2720 on 22 December 2023, which recognized that the civilian population in the Gaza Strip must have access to sufficient quantities of assistance that they need, including enough food, water, sanitation, electricity, telecommunications, and medical services essential for their survival, and that the provision of humanitarian supplies in the Gaza Strip needs to be sufficient to alleviate the massive humanitarian needs of the Palestinian civilian population throughout the Gaza Strip. And the resolution reaffirmed the obligations of the parties to the conflict under international humanitarian law regarding the provision of humanitarian assistance. And it demanded that they allow, facilitate, and enable the immediate, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale directly to the Palestinian civilian population throughout the Gaza Strip. Israel ignored the Security Council's demand, just as it disregarded subsequent Security Council resolutions 2728 and 2735, adopted in 2024, and 5 General Assembly emergency special session resolutions, which called on it again to allow and facilitate urgently needed humanitarian assistance at scale to the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza. In fact, Israel did the opposite of what was demanded to it. It continued to impede the provision of humanitarian goods and services indispensable to the survival of the Palestinian people, and it restricted humanitarian access by United Nations agencies, other states, and international humanitarian organizations. The court needs no reminding that Israel also disregarded its orders on provisional measures in the case brought by South Africa, which were issued on 26 January, 28 March, and 24 May 2024. Israel was required by the March order to take all necessary and effective measures to ensure, without delay, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, including food, water, electricity, fuel, shelter, clothing, hygiene and sanitation requirements, as well as medical supplies and medical care to Palestinians throughout Gaza, including by increasing the capacity and number of land crossing points and maintaining them open for as long as necessary. Israel has ignored these obligations and refused to comply. By May 2024, the court recognized that, quote, the humanitarian situation is now to be characterized as disastrous, as indeed it was. And the situation grew even worse thereafter. On 28 October 2024, the Commissioner General of UNRWA made this report to the General Assembly. The situation in Gaza is beyond the diplomatic vocabulary of the General Assembly. After more than a year of the most intense bombardment of a civilian population since World War II, and the restriction of humanitarian aid far below minimum needs, the lives of Palestinians are shattered. The surviving population lives in the greatest indignity. In the north, the population is trapped, awaiting death by airstrikes or starvation. On 2 December 2024, the Secretary General reported to the Cairo Ministerial Conference, nothing justifies the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Collective punishment is, of course, prohibited by Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Secretary General continued, yet conditions for Palestinians in Gaza are appalling and apocalyptic. Malnutrition is rampant. Famine is imminent. Meanwhile, the health system has collapsed. What we are seeing may well amount to the gravest international crimes. In the face of the gigantic needs, humanitarian aid is outrageously being blocked. This flies in the face of the clear requirements under international humanitarian law to respect and to protect civilians and to ensure their essential needs are met. It defies numerous General Assembly and Security Council resolutions demanding a ceasefire and unhindered humanitarian access. And it ignores the International Court of Justice, which issued binding provisional orders that must be complied with. As appalling and apocalyptic as the situation was in December, it is even worse today. The Secretary General recognized this in a statement on 8 April. More than an entire month has passed without a drop of aid into Gaza. No food, no fuel, no medicine, no commercial supplies. As aid has dried up, the floodgates of horror have reopened. Gaza is a killing field, and civilians are in an endless death loop. The current path is a dead end, totally intolerable in the eyes of international law and history. And the risk of the occupied West Bank transforming into another Gaza makes it even worse. Mr. President, in these circumstances, there can be no doubt that Israel is violating its obligations under international humanitarian law, including its obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention and customary international law, as reflected in Additional Protocol 1.